There is a man in the Bible whose name most people cannot pronounce. He appears in only 2 passages. He has no genealogy recorded for him, no famous lineage, no celebrated tribe, no royal blood that anyone bothered to write down. He was a foreigner in a foreign city, serving in a palace that was not his own, in a culture that was not his birthplace, surrounded by men who held far more power than he did. His name is Ebed-Melech. It means, in Hebrew, servant of the king. He was a Cushite, an African, almost certainly from the region south of Egypt, the land the ancient world called Cush, which corresponds roughly to what is now Sudan and northern Ethiopia. He was, by every measurable standard of the ancient world, an outsider. Not a son of Israel, not a member of the covenant community, not a prophet, not a priest, not a soldier, not a man whose name would normally be preserved in the sacred texts of a nation. And yet, in one afternoon, in one bold and compassionate decision, in one act of quiet moral courage that cost him real social and political risk, this man did what an entire royal court and an entire city full of religious professionals could not bring themselves to do. He saved the prophet Jeremiah from dying in a mud pit. That is the story. That is all of it, reduced to its simplest form. But the reduction does not do it justice, because the layers underneath that simple sentence, the layers of political fear, of institutional cowardice, of the specific texture of courage required to walk into the king's gate and say, out loud, in front of witnesses, that powerful men have done something evil, those layers are what make this story worth telling at length, in the dark, when the world is quiet and the mind is open. So let us begin. Let us go back, not to a myth, not to a legend, but to a city in crisis in the 6th century before the Common Era, where one man woke up one morning and decided that doing nothing was no longer acceptable. Section 1. Jerusalem on the Edge. Imagine a city that knows it is dying but refuses to say so out loud. That is Jerusalem in the final months before the Babylonian destruction, roughly 587 or 586 years before the Common Era, depending on which historical chronology you follow. The dates are approximate, but the atmosphere is not. The atmosphere is documented. The atmosphere is preserved in stone, in excavation layers, in the testimony of ancient scribes, and most vividly in the book of Jeremiah himself, a man who lived every single day of this collapse and wrote about it with a raw, aching honesty that has no equal in ancient literature. To understand what is happening to Ebed-Melech, you first have to understand what is happening to the city around him. Babylon is not on the horizon. Babylon has already arrived. King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, one of the most powerful military commanders the ancient world had ever produced, had already besieged Jerusalem once before. He had already taken captives back to Babylon in an earlier deportation. He had already installed a puppet king, a man named Zedekiah, as the ruler of what remained of the kingdom of Judah. Zedekiah was not a strong man. He was a man perpetually caught between pressure and paralysis, between the voice of the prophet telling him one thing and the voice of his court officials telling him another, and he never quite had the backbone to choose a side and hold it. Now, in this final siege, the Babylonian army has encircled the city completely. The walls are holding, the gates are sealed, but the food supply is running out. The cisterns are running low. People in the streets of Jerusalem are dying not from swords, but from starvation. The text of Jeremiah tells us this directly. Bread is almost gone. The situation inside the city walls has become desperate in a way that is difficult to fully comprehend across the distance of 26 centuries. And into this pressure cooker, the prophet Jeremiah is still speaking. That is important. That is the thing that makes Jeremiah so remarkable and so infuriating to the men in power around him. He does not go quiet when things get dangerous. He does not read the room and decide to soften his message. He does not tell people what they want to hear. He tells them what he believes is the actual truth, which in this case is this: the city cannot win. The Babylonian army is too powerful. The siege is too complete. The only path that preserves lives is surrender. This is not cowardice on Jeremiah's part. It is not defeatism. It is a theological and strategic assessment that he has been making, consistently and publicly, for years. He has been saying it before the siege began. He has been saying it throughout the siege. He believes, with the conviction of every fibre of his being, that this is what God has told him to say. That the nation's stubborn refusal to acknowledge its own failures, its idolatry, its injustice, its systematic oppression of the vulnerable, has set this course in motion, and the only remaining question is how many more people will die before the rulers accept what cannot be changed. The problem is that this message sounds, to the ears of Jerusalem's political leaders, like treason. Think about it from their perspective for a moment. You're an official in a besieged city. Your entire population is watching you. Morale is the only currency you have left. The soldiers on the walls need to believe there is a reason to keep fighting. The civilians huddled in their homes need to believe that the gates will hold, that something is coming, that resistance means something. And into the centre of this fragile, desperate attempt to maintain collective will, a prophet stands up and says, "Go out to the Babylonians. Stop resisting. Everyone who stays in this city will die by the sword, by famine, or by plague. Everyone who surrenders will live." To the officials, this is not a theological message. It is a psychological weapon aimed directly at the thing they most need to protect, the will to resist. They are not entirely wrong to feel this way. Ancient siege warfare was, in significant part, a psychological operation. If you could convince the population inside the walls that the situation was hopeless, you did not even need to breach the walls. The city would open from the inside. The Babylonian commanders knew this. Everyone knew this. And here is a man inside the city, a man with spiritual influence and a large public following, saying exactly what the enemy would want the population to believe. So the court officials go to King Zedekiah. They make their case. They are insistent. They are probably afraid of Jeremiah, afraid of the population, afraid of the Babylonians, afraid of everything all at once. And they frame their demand in the language of national security. This man is weakening the hands of the soldiers. He is draining the resolve of the people. He must be silenced. The king, being the man he is, does not stand firm. He does not protect Jeremiah. He does not remind his officials that Jeremiah has been speaking uncomfortable truths for decades, and that the pattern of ignoring those truths has brought them to exactly this place. He does the thing he always does. He steps aside. He tells the officials in words that Jeremiah records with what reads like quiet devastation. He is in your hands, for the king can do nothing against you. The king of Jerusalem, in the final days of his kingdom, confesses out loud to his own officials that he is powerless to protect one unarmed man from them. And so they take Jeremiah. Section 2. The pit. There is something about the method the officials choose that deserves very careful attention. They do not execute Jeremiah. They do not put him in a traditional prison cell. They do not publicly denounce him in the marketplace or hold a formal trial. What they choose instead is something more calculated, more deniable, and in many ways more cruel than a simple execution. They lower him into a cistern. To a modern ear, the word cistern might sound like a prison cell or perhaps a well. Let us be specific about what a cistern was in ancient Jerusalem, because the specificity matters to this story. A cistern was a large bottle-shaped pit carved into the bedrock beneath the city, designed to collect and store rainwater. In the rocky, semi-arid climate of ancient Judah, cisterns were essential infrastructure. They were cut deep into the earth, sometimes 10 to 15 feet deep, sometimes considerably more. They were plastered on the inside to prevent water from seeping back into the ground. The opening at the top was narrow, often small enough that only one person at a time could be lowered in or pulled out, by design to prevent evaporation. When not holding water, cisterns held mud. The text of Jeremiah chapter 38 is specific on this point. It tells us that there was no water in the cistern at this time, only mud. and it tells us that when Jeremiah was lowered in by ropes, he sank into the mud. Think about what that means physically. He was not standing on solid ground. He was not sitting in a dry chamber. He was in a dark enclosed pit with mud climbing up his legs, possibly to his waist, in a posture where any shift in position could cause him to sink further. He was in a place where no one outside would hear him if he called out. He was in a place where no one was planning to come back for him. He was in a place specifically designed, by the men who put him there, for him to die without the inconvenience of anyone having to actually kill him. This is the specific horror of what was done to Jeremiah. It was a murder by abandonment, a killing by looking away. It was a method that allowed the officials to tell themselves, and anyone who asked, that they had not executed the prophet. They had simply placed him in custody. And if the mud and the darkness and the cold and the slow failure of his body to sustain itself in that condition happened to end his life, well, that was not their doing. That was the circumstance. This is how institutional evil operates, not always with a sword, sometimes with paperwork, sometimes with a change in administrative classification, sometimes with a decision to look away at a particular moment, and a policy of not asking certain questions, and a bureaucratic language that distances the actor from the consequence. The officials of Jerusalem did not have bureaucratic paperwork, but they had a cistern, and they had ropes, and they had the king's tacit permission, and they had a very practiced ability to not think too hard about where the logic of their decision was leading. Now Jeremiah is in the pit. The city continues above him. The Babylonian siege continues. The king holds his fragile court. The officials conduct their affairs. The soldiers stand on the walls. People starve quietly in their homes. And at the bottom of a muddy pit somewhere beneath the palace grounds of Jerusalem, one of the greatest prophetic voices in all of human religious history is slowly being killed by silence and mud. The text does not tell us how long he was down there. It does not give us hours. It gives us a narrative sequence that moves quickly in the reading, but may have represented an agonizing passage of real time. What it tells us is that Jeremiah was in the pit, and then it tells us that someone heard. One person heard. One person, out of an entire city full of people, decided that what they had heard was something they could not simply fold into their day and move past, and that person was Ebed-Melech. Section 3. Enter the unexpected hero. Let us think carefully about who Ebed-Melech is before we watch him act. The text of Jeremiah chapter 38 identifies him as Ebed-Melech the Cushite, a palace official. Some translations render his role as eunuch, which was a common designation for certain classes of royal servants in the ancient Near East, men who served in the innermost circles of the royal household, who had access to the king and the court that most people would never have, and who occupied a social position that was simultaneously powerful and deeply constrained. Whether this designation refers to a literal physical condition or to an administrative title is a matter of scholarly debate, and for our purposes tonight, what matters most is not the specifics of his role, but the specifics of his identity. He is a Cushite. In the ancient world, the land of Cush, located to the south of Egypt, encompassing what is now Sudan and parts of Ethiopia and Eritrea, was known and respected. The Cushite people had their own kingdom, their own pharaohs, their own monumental architecture, their own sophisticated culture. In the 8th century before the Common Era, Cushite pharaohs had actually ruled Egypt itself. The 25th dynasty of Egypt was Cushite. These were not peripheral people. These were empire builders. But here in Jerusalem, Ebed-Melech is far from home. He is serving in a palace that is not his own, in a city whose god he may or may not have been raised to worship, in a court culture that was dominated by men who shared a lineage, a religious tradition, and a political identity that he did not share. He is the outsider in the room. He is the man whose foreignness is implied in every single mention of him by name. The Cushite is how the text always identifies him, as though his point of origin is important to the story, as though it is part of the meaning. And it is. Because the people who do not act in this story, the officials who threw Jeremiah into the pit, The king who looked away, the religious leaders who stayed silent, the soldiers who kept their heads down, the general population of a city in crisis who could not afford to spend political capital on one imprisoned prophet. All of those people were insiders. They were members of the covenant community. They were people who had grown up hearing the words of the Torah, who knew the name of this God, who had prayed in the temple, who had been circumcised into the tradition, who had everything in the world of religious and cultural formation that would, theoretically, produce moral courage. And they did nothing. The man who acts is the one with the least institutional belonging. The man who acts is the foreigner. The man who acts is the one who, in the framework of the ancient world, might have been expected to look out for himself and no one else, to keep his head down, not make waves, not draw attention to his foreignness by making bold public accusations against powerful men. That man is the one who moves. Now think about the information he's working with. Ebed-Melech has heard, probably through the complex whisper network intelligence system that always operates inside a royal court, that Jeremiah has been thrown into a cistern. He knows, or can reasonably infer, that the intent is for Jeremiah to die there. He knows who made this decision. He knows the level of power held by the men who made it. He knows that the king himself stood aside and allowed it to happen. He knows all of this. And then he gets up and walks to the Benjamin Gate where the king is holding court. Section 4. The Bold Confrontation. The Benjamin Gate. Let us place ourselves there for a moment. It is one of the major gates of Jerusalem, one of the points where the city opens to the outside world, or in this case, one of the points where the court and the populace interface. Ancient city gates were not merely functional structures, they were civic spaces. They were where commerce happened, where legal proceedings were held, where official announcements were made, where the king and his officials would sometimes receive petitioners and conduct the business of governance. To go to the King's Gate was to enter a semi-public arena where multiple people would be present, where your words would be heard not just by the king but by the entire court assembled around him. Ebed-Melech goes to that gate. He finds King Zedekiah there, and he speaks. The text gives us the substance of what he said, and it is direct to a degree that is almost startling. He says, "My lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they did to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the cistern. He is likely to die of hunger in the place where he is, for there is no more bread in the city." Read that again slowly. He does not hedge. He does not frame this as a concern or a question or a suggestion. He stands in the public gate in front of the king and the court, and he names the act that was done as evil. He names the men who did it. He specifies the mechanism of the harm, starvation, because there is no bread in the besieged city, which means even if the mud does not take Jeremiah, the lack of food will. He is making an argument that is simultaneously a moral accusation and a practical analysis, and he is doing this in front of witnesses. This is the part that does not get enough credit. It would be easier, it would be so much easier, to find a private moment with the king, to catch Zedekiah alone in a corridor, to whisper a concern, to phrase things softly in a way that does not put anyone publicly on the record. That is the kind of complaint that protects the complainer. That is the kind of moral action that leaves everyone with deniability. Ebed-Melech does not do that. He walks into the public gate. He speaks clearly. He calls it evil. He uses that word, not unwise, not unfortunate, not regrettable. Evil. The Hebrew word at the root of this accusation is one that carries strong moral weight. This was not a procedural error. This was a wrong done to a human being. This was a violation of something fundamental, and Ebed-Melech says so, in front of everyone. Now pause and feel the weight of what this moment costs him. He is a foreigner in a court that is under extreme stress. The men he is accusing are powerful. The man he is accusing them to is the very man who just told those men, openly, that he was powerless against them. The political logic of this situation offers Ebed-Melech absolutely no protection. He has no powerful ally he can appeal to. He has no tribe, no family network, no religious community that will back him. He has his position as a palace servant and the words in his mouth and whatever it is inside him that decided this was worth the risk. He stands there and he says it anyway. And here is the thing about King Zedekiah that makes this scene almost unbearably human in its complexity. The king listens. The same man who just handed Jeremiah over to his enemies, the same man who said, "I can do nothing against you," to those officials, now turns around and issues a direct order. He tells Ebed-Melech to take 30 men and go pull Jeremiah out of the cistern before he dies. 30 men, not 1 or 2, 30. Scholars have noted this number as significant. Perhaps the king feared that the officials would try to stop the rescue. Perhaps he was creating a show of force, large enough to make interference politically difficult. Whatever the reasoning, the king gives the order, and he gives it publicly. And he gives it because one man walked up and said the right thing at the right time with the right words and the right courage to make him. One man changed the outcome. Section 5. The King's Fragile Permission. We need to sit with King Zedekiah for a moment, because he is one of the most psychologically interesting figures in this entire story, and his complexity is directly relevant to the lesson Ebed-Melech's life carries. Zedekiah is not a villain. He is not a man who wanted Jeremiah to die. The text, when you read it carefully and in full context, paints a picture of a king who actually had a degree of respect for Jeremiah, who consulted him privately on multiple occasions, who believed to some extent that Jeremiah was speaking real truth. There is a passage just before this one, in chapter 37, where Zedekiah calls Jeremiah for a private consultation and asks him directly, "Is there a word from God?" And Jeremiah answers him honestly, and the king does not harm him. He actually keeps Jeremiah in a slightly less harsh form of custody than what the officials were demanding. So this is not a king who hated the prophet. This is a king who knew, probably, that the prophet was right. This is a king who was trapped between the advice he was receiving from powerful officials whose cooperation he needed to maintain his rule, and the voice of a man who kept saying things that made the officials furious, and that also happened to be true. When Zedekiah says, "I can do nothing against you," that is not the statement of a tyrant. That is the confession of a man who has traded away his moral independence piece by piece in exchange for political stability, and who now finds himself in a situation where he no longer possesses the authority to act on what he knows to be right, because he has spent that authority maintaining peace with people who are wrong. This is a very human condition. This is a very recognizable failure mode. The gradual erosion of moral autonomy through a long series of small compromises, each one justifiable in isolation, until the day comes when you discover that you cannot protect an innocent man from your own officials, because you have made yourself too dependent on those officials to challenge them, and then Ebed-Melech walks in, and something happens. Perhaps it is the public nature of the accusation, the fact that Ebed-Melech has said the word evil out loud in the gate, and that word is now out there in the world and cannot be taken back. Perhaps it is the specificity of the argument, the practical point that Jeremiah will die of hunger, because there is no bread, that the timeline is immediate, that this is not a theoretical injustice but an active one happening right now. Perhaps it is something in Ebed-Melech's bearing, in the directness of his words, in the moral authority that comes from a person who is genuinely unafraid because they know they are right. Whatever it is, the king responds. And this is perhaps the most important lesson embedded in this moment, for anyone who has ever felt that speaking to the powerful was pointless. Even a weak king can be moved. Even a king who has surrendered most of his moral independence to the people around him still has a residual capacity to do the right thing when someone walks in and names the wrong thing clearly enough. The door of conscience is almost never entirely sealed. It may be stuck. It may be nearly impossible to open. But Ebed-Melech finds the right words and the right moment and the right public forum, and he pushes it open. Permission is granted. 30 men are assigned. The rescue begins. Section 6. Compassion in the details. This is the part of the story that undoes me, personally, every time I read it. Ebed-Melech has the men. He has the authorization. He has the ropes. He knows where the cistern is. He could go directly to the cistern, lower the ropes and pull Jeremiah out. That would be the rescue. That would be the task completed. That would be sufficient. Instead, he stops. He goes to a storehouse under the treasury of the palace. The text says he takes old rags and worn-out cloth from there, and then he goes to the cistern. And before he lowers the ropes to Jeremiah, he lowers the rags. And he calls down into the pit, down into the dark, down to wherever Jeremiah is standing in the mud. And he says, "Put these rags and worn-out cloth between your armpits and the ropes, so that the ropes will not cut into his skin." That is the detail. That is the thing that Ebed-Melech stopped to think about in the middle of an urgent rescue mission in a city under siege, with 30 men around him, and the knowledge that the same officials who threw Jeremiah into the pit are still somewhere in the palace. He stopped to think about whether the ropes would hurt. He thought about the pain. He thought about what it would feel like for a man who had already been lowered into a muddy pit and left there to die, possibly for hours or days, to then have a rope drawn tight under his arms and pulled upward through his own body weight. He thought about the skin. He thought about the chafing. He thought about the specific, preventable discomfort that would come from pulling a human being out of a pit without padding. And he got rags. Old rags. Worn cloth. Soft things. Used things. Things that had been softened by time and use. Things that would sit gently between rope and skin without adding their own harshness to an already harsh situation. In the middle of a crisis, in a besieged city, with political enemies who might come to interfere at any moment, with a king whose permission could theoretically be rescinded, with an urgent need to complete this task before something changes, he stopped for the rags. Ebed-Melech got the rags. I want you to think about what kind of moral imagination it takes to do that. Because the rescue was the big action, the bold action, the visible action. Walking to the king's gate and naming the evil, that was the act of courage. The rags are something else. The rags are the act of seeing. They are what happens when your care for another person is not merely functional, but genuinely attentive, genuinely present to the specific humanity of the person in front of you. The rags are what happens when you do not merely want to help someone, but when you have actually thought, in detail, about what it is like to be them. Jeremiah was not just an abstraction to Ebed-Melech, not just a prophet whose survival was strategically important, not just a righteous cause that justified bold action. He was a man in a pit, a man in the mud, a man whose arms would hurt if the ropes were pulled too tightly. He was a specific, physical, vulnerable human being, and Ebed-Melech's care for him extended all the way down to that specific physical vulnerability. Rescue plus dignity, strength plus gentleness, justice plus tenderness. This is what the fullness of compassion looks like. It is not enough to do the right thing. It is not enough to take the courageous action. The quality of the help matters. The attentiveness of the care matters. The willingness to take 1 extra minute to go find the rags. That is not a footnote to the story. That is the soul of the story. Jeremiah is pulled up. He comes out of the pit alive. The mud releases him. The darkness releases him. The silence releases him. Hands reach down and hands pull and the ropes hold and the rags protect, and Jeremiah rises back into the light of a besieged, collapsing, heartbreaking city that is still, somehow, the world of the living. He is out. He is alive. And the first human hands that touched him in rescue were the hands of a man who had no particular obligation to save him. A foreigner. An outsider. A man with no institutional backing, no tribal protection, no guarantee of safety, and no certainty that this act would not cost him everything. Ebed-Melech saved the prophet. Section 7. Aftermath. Truth still stands. Now here is where the story asks something difficult of us. Jeremiah was rescued. He was moved after the rescue to the courtyard of the guard, a somewhat safer and more humane place of detention, not freedom, but not the pit. He was alive, and the text makes clear that he continued to speak, continued to be consulted by the king, continued to function as a prophet even in custody. But the city did not change course. The officials who threw Jeremiah into the pit were still in power. The king was still the king. The siege was still the siege. The Babylonian army was still outside the walls, patient and permanent and waiting. The rescue of Jeremiah did not trigger a collective change of heart. It did not cause the officials to repent and adopt Jeremiah's message. It did not cause the city to open its gates and negotiate a surrender that might have saved thousands of lives. Jerusalem fell anyway. In the year 586 before the Common Era, the Babylonian army breached the walls of Jerusalem. They burned the Temple of Solomon, one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, the spiritual centre of the entire Israelite religious tradition. They burned the palace. They burned the city. They took the survivors captive and marched them to Babylon. King Zedekiah fled, was captured, watched his sons executed in front of him, and then had his own eyes put out, so that the last thing he ever saw was the death of his children. He was then taken in chains to Babylon, where he died in prison. This is how the story ends for the city, and it raises a question that honest reflection cannot avoid. What was the point of the rescue? If the rescue of Jeremiah did not change the outcome of the siege, if the political leaders remained committed to their catastrophic course regardless, if Jerusalem fell and burned and was destroyed as Jeremiah had been predicting for decades, what did Ebed-Melech actually accomplish? This is not a trivial question. This is the question that every person who has ever done the right thing in a situation where the right thing did not change the outcome has had to ask themselves. What does righteous action mean when the system continues its catastrophic trajectory anyway? What does it mean to save one person in a city of thousands who are heading toward disaster? The answer that this story gives is not the comfortable one. It is not a story in which the right action produces the right outcome at the systemic level. Jerusalem burns whether Jeremiah is in the pit or not. The fall of the city is not prevented by this act of rescue, but Jeremiah lives. And that matters. Not because Jeremiah's life was worth more than other lives, not because prophets receive special protection that ordinary people do not. It matters because the truth that Jeremiah carried, the word that he had been speaking, the testimony that he had been called to preserve, needed to survive the destruction of Jerusalem in order to be recorded, in order to be read, in order to be sitting in your hand or playing through your headphones right now, 26 centuries later, as you lie in the dark and listen to the story of a man who was willing to be lowered into a pit rather than stop speaking the truth. Jeremiah's writings survived the destruction of Jerusalem. They were preserved through the catastrophe. They were carried into exile and transmitted across generations and eventually became part of the scriptural canon that three of the world's great religions share. The book of Jeremiah exists. The lamentations of Jeremiah exist. The prophecies and the prayers and the raw, honest, grief-soaked cries to God that Jeremiah wrote in the worst years of his life. They exist. Because Ebed-Melech got the rags. The rescue preserved the voice, and the voice preserved the truth, and the truth crossed 26 centuries to reach tonight, to reach you, to reach this moment in the dark where someone is listening, and something ancient is speaking. The fall of the city does not undo what was done in that courtyard. The flames that burn Jerusalem do not reach the rags. The truth was preserved precisely because one man decided, in a city that was deciding nothing, that he could not remain a bystander. Section 8. God's personal promise to Ebed-Melech. There is an epilogue to this story that is brief, easily missed, and possibly the most theologically significant element of the entire account. In Jeremiah chapter 39, verses 15 through 18, a passage that occurs within the larger narrative of Jerusalem's fall, there is a record of a message that God told Jeremiah to deliver specifically to Ebed-Melech, not to the king, not to the city, not to the prophet's own community, to the foreigner, to the outsider, to the man who got the rags. The message is this: I will bring my words against this city for harm and not for good, and they shall be accomplished before you on that day. But I will deliver you on that day, declares the Lord, and you shall not be given into the hand of the men of whom you are afraid. For I will surely save you, and you shall not fall by the sword, but you shall have your life as a prize of war, because you have put your trust in me, declares the Lord. Read that again. Jerusalem will fall. The city will be destroyed. Everything that Jeremiah has been predicting will come true. The harm will be accomplished. The men of power, the officials, the king, the soldiers, the ordinary people who stayed in the city, their fate is bound up with the fate of Jerusalem. But Ebed-Melech will not die by the sword. God will deliver him, and the reason given is explicit, not because he was useful, not because he was strategic, not because he saved our prophet and we are repaying the favour. The reason given is, because you put your trust in me. This is the theological heart of the story, and it deserves to be heard in full because it is easy to reduce it to a simple reward narrative. Good deeds lead to divine protection, and miss what is actually being said. What is being said is that God saw Ebed-Melech in a city of thousands, in a palace full of officials and soldiers and servants and priests. God specifically named this man, this foreigner, this outsider who had no obvious claim on the covenant, promises that the text of this tradition had articulated for centuries. This man whose people were not the descendants of Abraham, not the heirs of the Sinai covenant, not the citizens of Jerusalem in any inherited or tribal sense. God saw him. God spoke about him. God made him a specific, personal promise that was not made to the king or the court or the officially religious people who had the right language and the right lineage and the right institutional affiliation. The promise went to the man who acted. There is a long tradition within biblical scholarship and theology of noting that the Hebrew prophetic tradition had a surprisingly expansive understanding of who could be seen by God and who could stand in a right relationship with God. The prophets consistently challenged the assumption that right lineage automatically produced right standing. They challenged the assumption that religious ritual without justice meant anything at all. They challenged the comfortable insiders who assumed that belonging to the right group guaranteed protection, while those outside the group were invisible to the divine. Ebed-Melech is one of the most vivid embodiments of this prophetic challenge. He is outside, he is other, he is foreign. And God names him by name and says, "I will save you because you trusted me." The courage to act in the name of what is right, the courage to protect the vulnerable, to stand in the public gate and name the evil, to get the rags, to care about the skin. That courage is, in this text, recognized as an act of trust. Not merely trust in an institution or a doctrine or a tradition, but trust in the fundamental moral structure of reality. Trust that doing the right thing, even when it costs you, even when the city is burning, even when the outcome is not in your control, trust that it matters. God says, "I saw it. It mattered." Section 9. The world Ebed-Melech inhabited. A deeper look at Cush and context. To fully honour this story, we need to take one more look at where Ebed-Melech came from, because the ancient kingdom of Cush deserves more than a footnote. The land of Cush, in the ancient world, was a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and power. It lay south of Egypt, along the Nile, in the region that is now Sudan and northern Ethiopia. Its people built their own pyramids. There are actually more pyramids in Sudan today than in all of Egypt, a fact that surprises most people when they first encounter it. The Cushite pyramids are narrower, taller, more steeply angled than the Egyptian ones, but they are just as monumental, just as carefully constructed, just as expressive of a civilization that understood both engineering and the sacred. The kingdom of Cush had an on and off relationship with Egypt that stretched over millennia. At times, Egypt dominated Cush. At other times, Cush dominated Egypt. The 25th dynasty of Egypt, as mentioned earlier, was entirely Cushite. Pharaohs from Cush sat on the throne of Egypt and ruled the most powerful empire the ancient Near East had ever seen. Taharka, one of the most famous of these Cushite pharaohs, is actually mentioned in the Book of Kings, the same biblical literature that the Book of Jeremiah is part of. He tried to come to the aid of Judah when the Assyrians were threatening Jerusalem, a generation before Jeremiah's time. Cush was a real player in the geopolitics of the ancient world, so when Ebed-Melech shows up in the palace of Jerusalem as a royal servant from Cush, He's not simply a person from some peripheral unknown place. He's from a civilization that Jerusalem's own historical memory would have recognized. He may have arrived in Jerusalem through diplomatic channels, through trade, through the complex web of ancient Near Eastern court connections that brought people from across the known world into the service of various royal houses. We do not know his full story. We do not know how he came to be in Jerusalem, how long he had been there, whether he had family back in Cush, whether he ever returned. We know only this passage, this one morning, this one act. But knowing where he came from, knowing that he carried within him the heritage of a civilization that built its own pyramids, that produced its own pharaohs, that had its own sophisticated understanding of justice and governance and the sacred, enriches our reading of what he does. He's not simply an anonymous servant who happened to be in the right place. He's a man shaped by a culture with its own deep moral tradition, who brings that shaped self into contact with a moment of crisis and responds with the fullness of who he is. The outsider who saves the prophet is not a man without a world. He is a man with a different world, and that different world produces a different kind of courage. Section 10. The Architecture of Courage. What we learn from Ebed-Melech. Let us spend some time now with the architecture of what Ebed-Melech did. Not just what he did, but how he did it. Because the mechanics of his moral action teach us something that abstract principle alone cannot. First, he received information, and he did not normalize it. Someone told him what happened to Jeremiah, or he heard it through the court. The information arrived. And what happens, in most institutional contexts when information about an injustice arrives, is that the recipient goes through a process of normalization. They file it. They contextualize it. They remind themselves of everything they cannot do. They remind themselves of all the reasons this is not their problem, all the ways their involvement would be complicated, all the things they have to lose and how little they might actually be able to change. And then they go on with their day. Ebed-Melech did not normalize it. The text does not tell us about an extended period of deliberation. It does not tell us about sleepless nights of internal wrestling. It says he heard, and then he went to the king's gate. The action followed the information without a long pause for self-protection to set in. He heard, and he moved. There is a lesson in that rhythm. The longer we sit with information about an injustice before acting, the more time we give the self-protective machinery inside us to build a case for inaction. The more justifications accumulate, the more reasons pile up. The window of moral urgency, the moment when our conscience is loudest and our calculations about personal cost are quietest, is often brief. Ebed-Melech seems to have moved while that window was open. Second, he named what he saw with moral precision. He did not say, "I have some concerns about recent decisions regarding the prophet Jeremiah." He did not say, "Perhaps there might be a question about the treatment of the prisoner in the cistern." He did not use administrative language that obscured the moral reality. He said, "These men have done evil. Evil." The word matters. The precision matters. When we soften our moral language to make it more politically comfortable, we often inadvertently soften the urgency of the situation. We allow listeners to hear a concern rather than an accusation. We allow decision makers to respond with a process rather than an action. Ebed-Melech names the thing clearly, and that naming creates a different kind of demand. You cannot respond to the accusation of evil with a committee review. You can only act or refuse to act. Third, he chose the public forum. He went to the gate, not a corridor. He spoke in front of witnesses. He created an accountability structure for the king's response by making it impossible for the king to simply ignore the information privately. This was strategic moral courage. It was not merely brave. It was tactically intelligent. He understood that the king's weakness was susceptibility to social pressure, and he used that understanding to create pressure in the direction of the right action. Fourth, he did not stop at the big action. The rags. This is the fourth pillar. He completed the task with the same quality of attention that he brought to initiating it. He did not save Jeremiah heroically, and then hand him off to others to finish the job. He saw the entire rescue through, with care, to its most granular detail. He thought about the skin. He provided for the skin. The big action and the small action received equal moral investment. This is the complete architecture of what he did, and laid out this way, it is not mysterious or superhuman. It is teachable. It is reproducible. It is available to anyone in any century, in any culture, who is willing to receive information about an injustice and not normalize it, name it clearly, choose a public forum when possible, and care about the smallest details of how help is given. Section 11. The themes that carry this story. There are 4 themes in this story that cut across time and culture with the force of something permanently true. The first is, moral courage often comes from unexpected places. The expected sources of moral courage in Jerusalem were the king, the priests, the military leaders, the senior prophets, the elders at the gate. These were the men with the institutional authority and the public platform and the social legitimacy. These are the men who should have stood up for Jeremiah. None of them did. The man who stood up was the one no one would have predicted. The foreigner. The outsider. This pattern appears over and over in history. The people who act when everyone else does not are rarely the people you would have selected in advance as the most likely heroes. They are often people who, precisely because they are less embedded in the existing system, have less to lose by challenging it. They are often people whose outsider status gives them a clearer view of the system's failures, because they are not so invested in the system's self-image that they cannot see what it is actually doing. They are often people who have cultivated, through some combination of character and circumstance, a capacity to see a human being in front of them rather than an institutional problem. The second theme is, doing right often requires accepting social cost. Ebed-Melech did not get to act anonymously. He did not get to be a quiet hero who arranged Jeremiah's rescue through back channels while maintaining good relationships with everyone. He walked to the gate and he said the words, and the words were heard, and the words meant something about what he believed and where he stood. He accepted exposure. He accepted the possibility that the officials who had thrown Jeremiah into the pit might now view him as an enemy. He accepted the risk of becoming the kind of person in the court who makes powerful people uncomfortable. There is no way to do this kind of thing without accepting that cost, and the acceptance of that cost is not incidental to the moral act. It is part of what makes it a moral act. It is easy to care about justice in the abstract. It costs nothing to hold correct beliefs in private. The act becomes moral at the point where it begins to cost you something, where you could choose the easier path and you do not. The third theme is, compassion is not extra. It is part of righteousness. The rags are not a supplement to the story of Ebed-Melech's courage. They are not a charming detail that humanizes an otherwise political drama. They are a constitutive part of what makes this act righteous rather than merely effective. Righteousness in the biblical tradition is not simply the absence of injustice or the performance of correct actions. It carries within it a quality of attentiveness to the person, an orientation toward the specific, the physical, the vulnerable, the particular. The prophets who speak of righteousness in the Hebrew Bible always include care for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the specific, physical, socially vulnerable person standing in front of you. Ebed-Melech embodies that tradition. He cares about the prophetic mission. He cares about truth. He cares about justice. And he cares about the skin on Jeremiah's arms. He cares about all of it at once. The vertical commitment to God, to truth, to righteousness, and the horizontal attention to this person, this body, this specific preventable pain, are not in tension. They are the same act, expressed at different levels of scale. The fourth theme is, God protects those who stand for truth, even in collapsing systems. This is the promise to Ebed-Melech. The system collapsed. Jerusalem fell. The city burned. The king lost everything. The officials who threw Jeremiah into the pit, their fate is not recorded in detail, but we can infer that the general catastrophe of Jerusalem's fall swept them along with it. The city was not saved. The collapse was not reversed, but Ebed-Melech was saved. The specific man who did the specific thing was specifically seen. And the theological claim of this story is that this is not coincidence. It is not simply lucky that Ebed-Melech survived. It is something the text presents as deliberate, personal and direct. God saw this man, in this moment, in this act, and said, "You will live." In a world where collapsing systems tend to take everyone down with them regardless of individual virtue, this is a remarkable claim. It is saying that individual moral action within a corrupt or collapsing system is not futile. It is not wasted. It is not erased by the fact that the system fails anyway. It is seen, it is counted, and it has consequences that the trajectory of the system itself cannot cancel. That is an extraordinary thing to believe, and it is the thing that this story asks us to sit with in the dark as the city burns and one man survives who got the rags. Section 12. The Echo of Ebed-Melech Through History. There is a reason this obscure story has generated sustained attention across centuries of commentary, from ancient rabbinical interpreters to early Christian scholars to modern theologians across multiple traditions. It is not because Ebed-Melech performed a military miracle. It is not because he built anything that survived. It is not because he founded a tradition or wrote a text or organised a movement. It is because he did something that every generation can recognise, at a scale that every person, regardless of power or status, can contemplate doing themselves. He saw an injustice. He named it. He acted. He was careful in the acting. The rabbinical tradition, which preserved and transmitted these texts through centuries of its own exile and dispersion and persecution, found in Ebed-Melech a model for righteous action in adverse circumstances. Some commentators noted the parallel between Ebed-Melech, the outsider who acts while insiders remain passive, and the broader prophetic tradition's consistent insistence that right action is not the exclusive property of any group or lineage. The Gentile who acts righteously in the rabbinical framework becomes something that challenges comfortable assumptions about who is inside the circle of divine attention. Early Christian interpreters found in Ebed-Melech a prefiguration of what they understood as the expansion of God's covenant community beyond its ethnic and national boundaries, the outsider who protects the prophet of God becoming a symbol of something that would later be articulated more fully in their own tradition. African theologians and biblical scholars have found in Ebed-Melech something else, a corrective to centuries of interpretation that rendered African figures in the Bible invisible, peripheral, or merely functional. The deliberate identification of Ebed-Melech as a Cushite, his preservation by name in the sacred text, his receipt of a personal divine promise, these are not incidental. They are saying something about who is seen. They are saying something about the width of divine attention. And across all of these interpretive traditions, the rags keep appearing. Every serious engagement with this story eventually stops at the rags. The commentators notice them. The preachers cite them. The theologians find in them a principle about the quality of care that cannot be derived from any abstract statement about righteousness. You have to look at Ebed-Melech going to the storehouse. You have to watch him sort through the old cloth. You have to hear him calling down into the pit. Put these under your arms. That detail survives 26 centuries. That detail is still being discussed by people in universities and seminaries and churches and synagogues and living rooms and podcast studios right now, today, in the year of this recording. A man got rags for a prophet in a pit, and the world has not been able to forget it. Section 13. Jeremiah and Ebed-Melech. A meditation on the relationship. The text does not tell us what Jeremiah and Ebed-Melech said to each other. It does not record the moment when Jeremiah's feet came free of the mud, and his body was lifted into the air, and the light returned to his face. It does not tell us whether they embraced or whether words were exchanged, or whether Jeremiah simply stood there, covered in mud and exhaustion, and looked at the man who had come for him. But we can think about it. Jeremiah had been in that pit, in the dark, in the mud, in the silence, and no one had come. The court officials who had thrown him in were not coming. The king who had permitted it was not coming. The religious leaders of the city were not coming. The soldiers were not coming. Whatever community of supporters Jeremiah might have had was apparently either unable or unwilling to act. And then the rags came down. Before the rope, the rags. Before the rescue, the care for what the rescue would feel like. Before anyone pulled him up, someone thought about his arms. What does it do to a person, in extremity, to experience that specific quality of attention? What does it do to receive help that is not merely functional but genuinely tender? What does it mean to discover, in the lowest and most isolated moment of your life, that someone thought about the ropes? We cannot know what it did to Jeremiah. We cannot hear his voice in that moment, but the book of Jeremiah contains prayers and laments and cries to God that are among the most raw and honest in all of religious literature. He's a man who did not pretend that everything was fine. He argued with God. He cursed the day of his birth. He expressed anguish without softening it for religious propriety. And somewhere in the trajectory of that life, there was a day when a man named Ebed-Melech, a Cushite, a royal servant, an outsider, stood at the edge of a pit and threw down rags and said, "Protect yourself from the rope. That day is in the book. That man is in the book." And I think, in a life as hard as Jeremiah's was, it is not a small thing that someone came with rags. Section 14. The cisterns in our own time now. Here, in the final turn of this meditation, we have to do the thing that good documentary storytelling always eventually requires. We have to look at ourselves, because the cistern in this story is not only an ancient water storage pit beneath the palace grounds of a city that burned 26 centuries ago. The cistern is a recurring structure in human social organisation. The cistern is what happens when the powerful decide that a voice is inconvenient, and that the most efficient way to handle an inconvenient voice is not to silence it dramatically, but to lower it somewhere that most people will not look, and to move on. We have cisterns. They look different now. They are bureaucratic more often than they are physical. They are administrative more often than they are muddy. But the logic is the same. Put the inconvenient truth somewhere where it cannot be easily heard and wait for it to run out of resources. The whistleblower who is buried under legal process. The journalist in a country that criminalises reporting. The community organiser whose funding is cut. The prophet. And there are people doing prophetic work right now, in every country where this is being heard, whose message is uncomfortable enough that the people with power find it easier to manage the messenger than to engage with the message. Every one of those situations is a cistern, and every one of those situations is waiting for an Ebed-Melech. The question this story asks is not a comfortable one. It is not, will you remember the brave thing that a Cushite official did in Jerusalem in the 6th century? It is not, isn't it interesting what happened to Jeremiah? The question is, if you heard that someone was in the pit, what would you do with that information? Would you normalise it? Would you file it under things that are too complicated for me to address right now? Would you tell yourself that you're not powerful enough, not positioned well enough, not the right person, not in a situation where your action could actually change anything? Or would you go to the gate? And if you went to the gate, if you named the thing clearly, if you said the word evil out loud when it applied, if you organised the 30 men and got the ropes and came to the pit, would you stop for the rags? That is the question. Not just whether you would act, but whether you would act with the full quality of attention that the person in the pit deserves. Whether you would see them not just as a cause to be advanced, or a problem to be solved, but as a person whose arms might hurt, whose skin is real, whose suffering in the mud has a specific texture that your care can address if you take the extra minute to go find the old cloth. That is what Ebed-Melech teaches, and it is not a teaching that requires a theological framework to receive. It is available to anyone. It is the teaching of the rags. Section 15. Closing reflection. Sleep story tone. In a city where powerful men used pits to bury truth, one man used rags to protect it. The city is gone now. Jerusalem fell and was rebuilt, and fell again, and was rebuilt again. The palace where Ebed-Melech served is dust. The cistern where Jeremiah was lowered is, possibly, somewhere beneath the layers of a city that has been occupied and excavated and rebuilt so many times that its ancient geography is more archaeology than living memory. But the story survives. The names survive. Ebed-Melech, Jeremiah, Zedekiah. The names of the officials, Shephatiah, Gedaliah, Jehukal, Pashhur, men who made a decision to lower a prophet into a pit. Their names survive too, though not the way they might have hoped. They survive as the ones who did the thing that required an Ebed-Melech to undo. And Ebed-Melech survives as the one who got the rags. There is something, in the grammar of this story, that feels like a deliberate choice by whoever assembled these texts. The choice to record not just the rescue but the detail. The rags did not need to be in this story. The rescue works as a story without them. You could tell it in 2 sentences. Ebed-Melech went to the king and accused the officials. The king gave him 30 men. They pulled Jeremiah out of the pit. That is the rescue. That is the fact. But the rags are in the story. They are there, in the ancient text, in the verses that were copied by hand for generation after generation, preserved through the destruction of the temple and the exile in Babylon, and the return, and the Second Temple period, and the Roman destruction, and the medieval manuscript tradition, and the invention of the printing press, and the digitization of scripture, and the text-to-speech rendering that is reading these words to you right now. The rags made it through all of that, which means that the people who preserved this story understood that the rags were not a footnote. They were the point. Or at least, they were part of the point in a way that the people doing the preserving recognized and chose to honor. So tonight, as you settle into wherever you are listening from, your bed, your room, your city, your corner of the world that is part of this strange, global, nocturnal community, take this with you. The rescue happened quietly. No armies came. No fire fell from heaven. No miraculous army appeared on the horizon. A man heard something, went somewhere, said something, gathered some men, found some rags, and lowered them into a pit. That is the whole story. Sometimes the bravest faith in the world looks exactly like that. It looks like doing the quiet thing that needs to be done. It looks like naming the thing that everyone else is pretending not to see. It looks like taking the extra minute when every situation is urging you to hurry, to think about what the help will feel like for the person receiving it. It looks like seeing the skin. It looks like finding the rags. In a world full of cisterns, be the one who goes to the gate. In a world full of people who normalize the mud, be the one who goes to the storehouse. In a world that is very good at walking past pits, be the one who stops. The city may burn anyway. The fall may come regardless. The outcome of the larger system may not be in your hands. But the person in the pit is in your hands, and you can get the rags. Outro. Sleep Theories Community. Close. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight. If this story moved something in you, if the name Ebed-Melech is one you want to carry into tomorrow, share it with someone. Leave it in the comments. Let someone know that this obscure, barely mentioned, foreignly named rags-gathering man existed and did this thing and was seen. If you suggested tonight's topic, thank you. You brought this story to this community, and this community needed it. If you are new to Sleep Theories, welcome. We are glad you are here. Take your time. Look through the library. There are many more stories where this one came from. Stories from history, from scripture, from the unexplained corners of the world, all told slowly at night, for people who want the last thing they think about before sleep to be something worth thinking about. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't yet. Leave a review on Spotify if you listen there. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are out there in the dark looking for exactly this. And drop your location in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from tonight, because somewhere out there right now there are people in Sao Paulo and Seoul and Stockholm and Accra and Auckland all listening to the same story about a man in Jerusalem who got some rags, and that is one of the most quietly remarkable things about the world we live in. Stay with us, sleep well, we will see you in the next one. Hey everyone, welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something that would genuinely help us out. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know. Seriously, it makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people who love this kind of content. Also, if you want to, drop a comment telling us what time it is for you right now and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. No pressure though, only if you feel like it. And of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It keeps us going. Alright, let's get into it. A whisper in the darkness. Imagine a night so quiet you can hear the oil lamps flickering. Picture a massive stone sanctuary in the ancient city of Shiloh, where shadows dance across walls that have witnessed centuries of worship. The air is thick with the scent of incense and burning oil, that peculiar combination of cedar smoke and olive essence that clings to sacred spaces. Outside, the wind moves through the hills of Israel like a whispered prayer, carrying with it the distant bleating of sheep settling for the night and the occasional call of a desert owl. Inside, in the sacred chambers near the Ark of the Covenant, a young boy lies sleeping on a simple mat. The stones beneath him still hold the warmth of the day's sun, though the night air has begun to cool. His breathing is steady, deep, the kind of sleep that comes from honest physical labour and a clear conscience. His name is Samuel. This is not a story about miracles that shake mountains or angels descending in blinding light. This is a story about something quieter, something more intimate, something that happens in the space between waking and dreaming, where the boundaries of reality become permeable. It is about a voice in the darkness, a child who learned to listen when the entire world had gone deaf, and a moment that would alter the spiritual trajectory of an entire nation. Because sometimes the most profound truths do not arrive with thunder and earthquake. Sometimes they do not announce themselves with burning bushes or pillars of fire. Sometimes they arrive in whispers, in the stillness between breaths, in the gentle calling of a name spoken 3 times before it is finally understood. What you're about to hear is one of the most mysterious and beautiful moments in ancient scripture. A moment when heaven reached down to touch earth, not through spectacular signs, but through the simple act of calling a child's name in the night. But it is also a story about silence broken, about the end of a spiritual drought, about what happens when the divine decides to speak again after generations of absence. This is the story of Samuel, the boy who heard God speak when the rest of the world had forgotten how to listen. And perhaps, hidden within this ancient narrative, there are questions we have forgotten to ask. Questions about why heaven goes silent. Questions about who gets chosen to break that silence. Questions about whether the voice that called to Samuel in that darkened sanctuary is still calling, still speaking, still searching for those rare individuals who know how to say, "I am listening." Chapter 1. Hannah's Promise. To understand Samuel's calling, we must first understand how he came to be sleeping in that sanctuary. His story begins not with him, but with his mother, a woman named Hannah, who knew the bitter taste of desperation and the hollow ache of prayers that seemed to vanish into an empty sky. In the hill country of Ephraim, in a small village whose name has been lost to history, there lived a man named Elkanah who had 2 wives, as was common in that era. His first wife, Peninnah, had given him several children, sons to carry his name, daughters to arrange in marriage, a legacy written in flesh and blood. His second wife, Hannah, had given him only heartache and unanswered prayers. Year after year, Hannah remained childless, and in a culture where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear children, this was not just a personal grief. It was a social death sentence, a daily humiliation, a question mark hanging over her entire existence. Neighbours would whisper, extended family would exchange knowing glances, even well-meaning friends would offer useless advice, or suggest that perhaps she had offended God in some way, that her barrenness was divine punishment for some unknown sin. Elkanah loved Hannah. The text makes this clear. He would give her double portions at feasts, trying to compensate with material generosity for what biology had denied her. He would ask her with genuine confusion, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" It was a question born of love but blind to understanding. He could not fathom that the issue went deeper than his affection, that Hannah's grief was not about him at all, but about her own sense of purpose, of completion, of being seen as fully human by the society around her. Peninnah, with the cruelty that can only come from insecurity dressed as triumph, would taunt Hannah relentlessly. Every time the family made their annual pilgrimage to the sanctuary at Shiloh to worship and offer sacrifices, Peninnah would remind Hannah of her barrenness. The taunts were not subtle. They were designed to cut deep, to remind Hannah that in the eyes of the world she was incomplete, cursed, forgotten by the very God she came to worship. Peninnah would parade her children before Hannah, would make comments about how blessed she was, would turn every moment of worship into a reminder of Hannah's failure. And Hannah would weep. She would refuse to eat. The pain went beyond physical longing for a child. It touched something deeper, the existential question that haunts anyone who feels overlooked by the divine. Does God see me? Does he hear my prayers? Am I worthy of his attention? Or am I simply background noise in a universe too vast to care about one woman's grief? The pilgrimage to Shiloh was supposed to be a time of joy, of celebration, of renewal. But for Hannah, it became an annual reminder of everything she lacked. Year after year she would go through the motions of worship, while her heart broke quietly in places no one could see. One year, during their pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah could bear it no longer. The weight of accumulated grief, the years of disappointment, the constant humiliation, all of it reached a breaking point. While the rest of the family feasted after the sacrifice, celebrating with wine and roasted meat, Hannah slipped away to the entrance of the sanctuary. She stood there, in the place where earth met heaven, in the threshold between the mundane and the sacred, and she prayed with an intensity that went beyond words. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Her whole body shook with the force of her grief and desperation. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands trembled. This was not the polite ritualized prayer of public worship. This was raw, unfiltered communion with the divine. This was a woman pouring out her soul, holding nothing back, demanding to be heard by a God who had seemed deaf to her pleas for years. She made a vow that day, one that would echo through generations. If God would grant her a son, she would give him back to God. Not for a season, not for a few years, but for his entire life. The child would be dedicated to divine service from the moment he was weaned. It was the prayer of a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is not something to hold on to, but something to offer back to its source. She was not bargaining with God so much as she was declaring her willingness to participate in something larger than her own desires. Eli, the high priest, sat by the doorpost of the sanctuary and watched this strange woman swaying and muttering. In his aging, perhaps cynical view of human nature shaped by years of dealing with corrupt worshippers and his own corrupt sons, he assumed she was drunk. The accusation was harsh, almost cruel. What are you doing here, intoxicated in the house of the Lord? How dare you bring your drunkenness into this sacred space? Hannah lifted her eyes, and in them Eli saw not the glaze of wine, but the clarity of absolute desperation, the look of someone who has nothing left to lose, who has stripped away all pretense and pride, who stands naked before God with only their need. She explained that she was not drunk, but deeply troubled, pouring out her soul before God. She had been praying out of her great anguish and grief. Something in her words, or perhaps in her eyes, or perhaps in the raw authenticity of her pain, convinced Eli. His response was both blessing and prophecy. Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant what you have asked of him. It is unclear whether Eli knew what he was saying, whether he was simply offering the standard priestly blessing, or whether something moved through him in that moment. Some whisper of the divine speaking through a man who had grown complacent in his religious duties. But the words landed on Hannah like rain on parched earth. Hannah left the sanctuary that day transformed. Her face was no longer downcast. She ate. The grief lifted from her countenance like a fog dispersing under the morning sun. She had been heard, if not by man, then by something infinitely greater. She did not yet have the child she longed for, but she had something perhaps more precious. The certainty that her prayers had reached their destination, that her voice had penetrated the silence, that she mattered to the God she served. Within the year, Hannah conceived. When she gave birth to a son, she named him Samuel, which in Hebrew carries the meaning heard by God, or asked of God, or some translations suggest name of God. The name itself was a testimony, a permanent reminder that this child was an answer to prayer, a gift that came from somewhere beyond the ordinary workings of the world. Every time someone spoke his name, they were acknowledging that this boy represented the moment when heaven responded to earth, when silence gave way to acknowledgement. For the first few years of his life, Samuel remained with Hannah. She nursed him, taught him his first words, held him close during thunderstorms, watched him take his first steps, knowing that each day brought them closer to the moment of separation. She must have memorized the sound of his laugh, the feel of his small hand in hers, the weight of him sleeping against her chest. She was not raising a son to keep, but a son to give away, and that knowledge must have coloured every moment with a bittersweet intensity. When he was old enough to be weaned, somewhere around 3 years old by the customs of that time, Hannah kept her vow. She could have rationalised her way out of it. She could have argued that God understood, that the vow was made in a moment of emotional extremity, that surely keeping her son would be acceptable. But Hannah was a woman who understood that integrity means keeping promises even when they cost you everything. She took Samuel to Shiloh. She brought him before Eli, the same priest who had blessed her years earlier, and she said words that must have torn her heart even as she spoke them. I am the woman who stood here praying. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. Then Hannah sang, not a lament, but a song of triumph and praise. She sang of God overturning the proud and lifting up the humble. She sang of barren women bearing children and the powerful being brought low. She sang of the Lord bringing death and giving life, bringing down to the grave and raising up. She sang of God judging the ends of the earth, giving strength to his king and exalting his anointed. Her song was radical, revolutionary, a declaration that the God she served delighted in reversing the expectations of the world, in using the weak to shame the strong, in lifting up those the world had written off as irrelevant. And then she left her son in that sanctuary and went home. Imagine being that child, too young to fully understand why your mother brought you to this vast, echoing building filled with strange smells and unfamiliar faces and then walked away. Too young to grasp that you had become the physical embodiment of a promise, a living prayer offered back to its source. You watch her figure receding, growing smaller, disappearing down the road back to the only home you have ever known, and you are left in the care of an old man whose eyes can barely see you, whose own sons are corrupt, in a place that will become your entire world. Samuel's childhood was unlike any other in Israel. While other boys played in fields and learned their father's trades, running through olive groves and swimming in streams, Samuel grew up in the sacred space of the tabernacle. His world was one of ritual and reverence, of ancient objects and whispered prayers, of shadows and lamplight, and the constant awareness that this place was different from all other places. He opened the doors of the sanctuary each morning, flooding the holy space with light. It was his job to unlock the heavy wooden doors that sealed the sacred from the profane, to let in the dawn and with it the worshippers who would come seeking connection with the divine. He assisted Eli in the daily tasks of worship, learning the intricate patterns of sacrifice and ceremony, memorizing which offerings are required, which procedures, understanding the difference between sin offerings and burnt offerings and peace offerings, learning to read the subtleties of ritual purity. He tended the lamps that burned through the night, ensuring their wicks were trimmed and their oil replenished. This was not glamorous work. It required attention to detail, a willingness to wake in the darkness to check that the flames had not guttered out, an understanding that these small acts of maintenance were what kept the sacred space functioning. The lamps represented the presence of God, and Samuel learned that presence requires constant tending, constant attention, constant care. He cleaned the sacred vessels, swept the courts, washed the linens used in ceremonies, helped prepare the incense, carried water, ran errands. He memorized scriptures, learning to recite the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the tales of Moses and the Exodus, the laws given at Sinai. His education was entirely religious, entirely focused on service, entirely oriented towards something beyond himself. By all accounts, Samuel was a good child, humble, obedient, faithful in small things. The text tells us he grew in favour with both the Lord and with people. He was not resentful of his circumstances. He did not seem to chafe against the boundaries of his unusual childhood. Perhaps he had accepted that this was simply who he was, the boy who belonged to God, the boy who lived in the house of the Lord. But what must it have been like psychologically? To have no mother to comfort you when you woke from nightmares, to have no siblings to quarrel and play with, to grow up watching Eli's corrupt sons come and go, seeing the way they abused their position, hearing the whispers of their misconduct, to be surrounded by holiness and yet witness its corruption, to serve faithfully while those who should have been models of righteousness displayed only greed and lust and contempt for the sacred. Did Samuel wonder why he had been left here? Did he feel abandoned by the mother who had kissed him goodbye and walked away? Did he question whether the God he served even noticed his small acts of service? The text does not tell us. We see only the external facts, a boy growing up, performing his duties, learning his role. But surely there were moments of loneliness, moments of doubt, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy for small shoulders to carry. Hannah visited when she could. Each year during the family's annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, she would bring Samuel a new robe she'd made for him, watching him grow, trying to compress a year of mothering into a few brief encounters. These visits must have been both blessing and torment. The joy of seeing his mother mingled with the pain of watching her leave again. The new robe, a reminder that somewhere he had a home, a family, a life he was not permitted to live. Yet there is no indication that Samuel rebelled or resented his circumstances. He simply continued. Day after day, year after year, faithful in the small things, present in the sacred space, available to be used however God saw fit. There was no indication in those early years that he would become anything more than a helpful assistant to an aging priest, that he would one day be the voice through which God spoke to an entire nation. But God, it seems, has a habit of preparing his instruments in obscurity before bringing them into the light. Samuel was being shaped by his circumstances, formed by his loneliness, refined by his faithfulness in tasks that no one celebrated. He was learning what it meant to serve without applause, to be obedient without immediate reward, to remain present even when presence felt like punishment. He was learning to listen in the silence. Chapter 2. The State of Israel at the Time. To appreciate what happened on that quiet night when God called Samuel's name, you need to understand the spiritual condition of Israel during this period. It was, to put it simply, a disaster. But the disaster raises uncomfortable questions that the text never fully answers. Questions about divine silence. Questions about why systems of worship become corrupt. Questions about what happens when the mediators between heaven and earth become obstacles instead of conduits. The problem started with Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. These two men had inherited their father's position as priests, but they had not inherited his reverence for the sacred. They were corrupt in ways that went beyond simple moral failing. They actively perverted the worship of God, treating the sacrifices and offerings as opportunities for personal gain, turning the sacred into the profane with a systematic cruelty that suggests something darker than mere greed. When people brought animals to sacrifice at Shiloh, the priests were entitled to a specific portion of the meat according to the law of Moses. But Hophni and Phinehas were not content with their allotted share, with what had been designated as rightfully theirs. They wanted more. They wanted the best. They wanted what belonged to God. They would send their servants to threaten worshippers, demanding the choicest cuts of meat before the fat was even burned on the altar, as required by law. The fat belonged to God. That was non-negotiable in the sacrificial system. The burning of the fat was the moment when the sacrifice became truly sacred, when the offering transitioned from human gift to divine acceptance. But Hophni and Phinehas did not care about divine acceptance. They cared about their appetites. If people objected, if they tried to follow the proper procedures and insist that the fat be burned first, the servants would respond with threats of violence. "We will take it by force if necessary." The priests were literally stealing from God, taking what belonged to the altar and consuming it themselves. They were turning worship into extortion, using their position of spiritual authority to exploit the vulnerable and the faithful. But their corruption went even darker, into territories that the text only hints at with uncomfortable brevity. They engaged in sexual immorality with women who served at the entrance to the sanctuary. These were women who had dedicated themselves to service at the tabernacle, who came to worship and serve with sincere devotion, and Hophni and Phinehas exploited them, used their authority and position to prey upon those who should have been under their protection. They turned the house of God into a place of exploitation and abuse, where the very people who were supposed to represent divine holiness became perpetrators of trauma. Worship became a source of fear rather than transcendence. People stopped coming, or when they came with cynicism and resentment, going through the motions but empty of faith. How could you trust a system where the gatekeepers were predators? How could you believe in the holiness of a place where the priests defiled it daily? The sanctuary at Shiloh, which was meant to be the central hub of Israel's spiritual life, became instead a monument to religious corruption. Eli knew what his sons were doing. The text makes this painfully clear. People told him. They came with reports of misconduct, of abuse, of exploitation. He heard the rumours and saw the evidence. He was not ignorant. He was not blind to their crimes. And to his credit, he confronted them. But his rebukes were weak, almost apologetic, carrying no weight and no consequence. Why do you do such things? I hear reports from the people about your wicked deeds. If someone sins against another person, God may mediate. But if someone sins against the Lord, who will intercede? The words acknowledge the problem but offer no solution. There is no threat of removal from office, no stripping of authority, no punishment that might actually deter the behaviour. Just words, just disappointment, just a father hoping his wayward sons might suddenly develop a conscience they had never demonstrated. Hophni and Phinehas ignored their father and continued their corruption. Why wouldn't they? There were no consequences. Eli's position as high priest gave him the authority to remove them, to appoint others, to enforce standards. But he did nothing, and his inaction was itself a form of action, a choice that enabled the continued degradation of worship. The impact on Israel's spiritual life was catastrophic. The text records it with devastating simplicity. The people came to despise the offerings to the Lord. Think about what that means. The sacrificial system was the heart of Israel's covenant relationship with God. It was how sins were atoned for, how gratitude was expressed, how the community maintained its connection with the divine. And people were learning to despise it, to see it as corrupt and meaningless, to associate worship with exploitation rather than with holiness. Faith withered. Cynicism spread. A generation was growing up believing that God either did not care about corruption in his own house, or that he was powerless to stop it, or worse, that he did not exist at all, and the whole system was simply a mechanism for priestly power and exploitation. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this era, the detail that haunts the narrative with its implications, was not the corruption of the priests. It was the silence of heaven. The scripture records it with haunting simplicity. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. Think about what that means. In a culture where prophets and priests were meant to be the conduits between God and humanity, the channel had gone quiet. God was not speaking. Or if he was, no one was hearing. Prophecies were scarce to the point of being legendary. Divine visions were so uncommon that when someone claimed to have received one, it was met with skepticism rather than expectation. But why? The text does not explain. It simply records the fact of divine silence as if it were weather, as if the absence of God's voice was as natural and unremarkable as a drought. But this raises uncomfortable questions. Had God withdrawn because of the corruption? Was the silence a form of judgment, a divine turning away from a people who had corrupted worship? Or had the people simply stopped listening? Had they become so cynical and so wounded by a religious hypocrisy that they could no longer hear what was being said? Or was there another possibility, one that the text does not explore but that hangs in the air like smoke? Perhaps the priests, who were supposed to be the mediators between God and people, had become such effective blockers of communication that divine messages simply could not get through. Perhaps Hophni and Phinehas were not just corrupt individuals, but symptoms of a systemic failure, a spiritual infrastructure that had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Israel was spiritually adrift, navigating by dead reckoning through waters where the stars had gone dark. There were no prophets to consult, no clear word from God about how to proceed, no divine guidance about which way to turn, just the daily grind of existence, the hollow rituals performed without meaning, the slow death of a people's faith in the face of institutional betrayal. This was the world into which Samuel was growing up, a world where the representatives of God were corrupt, where worship had become hollow, where heaven seemed distant and disinterested. If you were a young person in that era, what would you believe about the divine? Would you expect God to speak? Would you even know what his voice sounded like? Would you be able to distinguish a divine call from your own imagination or from the voice of a very human priest? Samuel cleaned the lamps each evening, ensuring the light would burn through the night. It was a practical task, a maintenance duty, nothing spiritual about it. He trimmed the wicks, refilled the oil reservoirs, ensured the flames were steady. But in that small act, there was a symbol that perhaps Samuel himself did not fully understand. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Somewhere in the darkness a light still burned, and into that darkness, cutting through the silence that had lasted for generations, a voice was about to break through. Chapter 3. The night God spoke. The night began like any other. Samuel had completed his duties for the day, working through the familiar routines that structured his life. The sanctuary was clean, the floors swept, the vessels washed and arranged in their proper places. The lamps were lit, their flames steady, casting dancing shadows across the ancient stones. The sacred space was prepared for the silence of the evening hours, for the long watch through darkness toward dawn. Eli, now elderly and nearly blind, his eyes grown dim from age and perhaps from seeing too much corruption without acting, had retired to his usual place. He moved slowly now, carefully, feeling his way along walls he had walked beside for decades. His sleeping area was separate but nearby, close enough that Samuel could hear him if he called, out in the night. Samuel lay down in his customary sleeping spot somewhere near the chamber where the Ark of the Covenant rested. The exact location is not specified in the text, but the implication is clear. He slept in proximity to the most sacred object in all of Israel, closer to the physical representation of God's presence than anyone else in the nation that night. The Ark was the most sacred object in Israel, a gold-covered chest containing the tablets of the law, a jar of manna, and Aaron's staff that had budded. But more than its contents, the Ark represented the very presence of God among his people. It was the throne of the invisible king, the place where heaven touched earth, the point of contact between the divine and the mortal. To sleep near it was to sleep in the shadow of holiness, though Samuel likely thought nothing of it. This was simply where he slept, as ordinary to him as any bedroom, as familiar as his own breathing. The lamp of God was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. This detail matters more than it might initially seem. In the Jewish tradition, the lamp in the sanctuary, the menorah that burned with consecrated oil, was not allowed to go out until morning light made it unnecessary. It represented the presence of God, the light that persisted even in darkness, the hope that had not yet been extinguished. The phrase, "the lamp of God had not yet gone out," carries within it both promise and warning. Not yet, but it could. The light was still burning, but barely. The presence was still there, but fading. As long as the lamp burned, there was hope. As long as the light persisted against the encroaching darkness, God had not abandoned his dwelling place entirely. Samuel drifted into sleep, a boy exhausted from the honest labour of serving in the house of God. His breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed. He sank into that deep, dreamless sleep that comes from physical work and a clear conscience. The sanctuary around him settled into its nighttime sounds. The creak of cooling stone, the whisper of wind through high windows, the distant cry of a night bird, the soft flutter of the lamp flames, and then, in the darkness, cutting through the silence like a knife through cloth, he heard his name. Samuel. The voice was clear, distinct, personal. Not a shout that would echo through the halls, but not a whisper that could be mistaken for imagination either. It had the quality of someone standing nearby, speaking with intention and purpose, with the certainty that they would be heard. It was a voice that expected a response. Samuel's eyes snapped open. His heart leaped in his chest. There was no confusion, no moment of disorientation. He knew immediately that someone had called him. The voice had been too clear, too deliberate, too unmistakably directed at him. In the darkness, with the lamp casting its uncertain light, Samuel did what made perfect sense to a boy who had grown up serving under an elderly priest. Eli must need something. The old priest was nearly blind now, stumbling in the darkness. Perhaps he had dropped something. Perhaps he needed water. Perhaps he was unwell and required assistance. Samuel threw off whatever covering he used against the night chill and ran to where Eli slept. "Here I am. You called me?" The response was immediate, instinctive. "Here I am." Two words that would become the defining posture of Samuel's entire life. Not, "What do you want?" Not, "Can it wait until morning?" Just presence. Just availability. Here I am. Eli, pulled from sleep and confused, his mind foggy with the remnants of dreams, looked in the direction of Samuel's voice with eyes that could barely make out shapes in the darkness. "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Samuel returned to his place, perhaps a little puzzled, but not overly concerned. Perhaps he had been dreaming. Perhaps the transition from sleep to waking had jumbled his perceptions. Perhaps the old man had called out in his sleep and forgotten. These things happen. The mind plays tricks in the boundary spaces between consciousness and unconsciousness. He lay back down, pulled his covering around him, and closed his eyes, willing himself back towards sleep. The sanctuary settled back into silence. The lamp continued its steady burning. Outside, the wind moved through the hills with a sound like breathing. Samuel's heartbeat slowed back to its resting rhythm. Samuel? Again. The same voice, the same clarity, the same undeniable sense that someone was speaking directly to him, calling him by name with purpose and intention. This was not imagination. This was not the remnant of a dream clinging to the edge of waking. This was not the echo of Eli's voice misheard in the darkness. Someone had called his name clearly and deliberately, as real as the stone beneath him and the lamplight flickering against the walls. Once more, Samuel got up and went to Eli. His bare feet made soft sounds against the cold stone floor. His breathing was quicker now, his confusion deeper. If Eli had not called the first time, then who had? "Here I am. You called me." Eli, now more awake and perhaps slightly irritated at being disturbed a second time, sent him away again with a tone that suggested both confusion and mild frustration. "I did not call, my son. Go back and lie down." Samuel returned, but now there was a question forming in his mind that would not be silenced. If Eli was not calling him, then who was? Was someone playing a trick? Was there an intruder in the sanctuary hiding in the shadows, calling his name for some unknown purpose? But the voice had not seemed mischievous or threatening. It had been steady, certain, intimate, the kind of voice that knows you. that has the right to call your name. He lay back down, but this time sleep did not come easily. His eyes stayed open, staring into the darkness above him. His ears strained for any sound, any indication of who or what had spoken to him. The lamp flickered. A moth circled near its flame. Time stretched and compressed in that strange way it does when you are lying awake in the dark, unsure whether minutes or hours are passing. Samuel. The third time, Samuel abandoned any doubt or hesitation. Someone was calling him, and if it was not Eli, then perhaps the old priest was confused. Perhaps he was calling out without realizing it. Perhaps his dreams were speaking through him. Samuel got up once more, faster now, urgent, and went to Eli. He stood at the foot of the old priest's sleeping mat, his young face barely visible in the dim light that filtered in from the main chamber. "Here I am. You called me." And finally, after decades of serving in the sanctuary, after years of watching the word of the Lord become rare and vision scarce, after witnessing the corruption of his sons and the slow death of Israel's faith, Eli understood. The realization must have hit him like a physical blow. God was calling the boy, not the high priest, not the experienced religious leader, not the man who had served in this place for decades. The boy who cleaned the floors and tended the lamps and slept near the ark without fully comprehending what that meant. Eli's response is one of the most beautiful moments in the entire narrative. He could have been jealous, wounded by the divine bypassing, bitter that his years of service were being overlooked in favour of a child. He could have been defensive, questioning whether this was really happening, whether Samuel was perhaps confused or making things up. He could have claimed the voice for himself, insisted that any divine communication should come through proper channels, through the established hierarchy of priesthood. But instead, Eli became a teacher in the truest sense. He gave Samuel the gift of understanding and the words that would change everything. He put aside whatever personal feelings he might have had and focused entirely on helping Samuel navigate what was about to happen. "Go and lie down," Eli said, and you can hear in those words both resignation and hope, both the sadness of being passed over and the wonder that God was speaking again at all. And if he calls you, say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Those words, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," not "Who are you?" not "What do you want?" not "Prove yourself to me." Just openness, just availability, just the humble acknowledgement that if God is speaking, the only appropriate response is to listen. Samuel returned to his place one more time. He lay down in the darkness, the lamp of God still burning nearby, casting its uncertain light across ancient stones, and he waited. His heart must have been pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His mind must have been racing with questions and fears and wonder. What does the voice of God sound like? What will he say? Am I worthy to hear it? What if I do not understand? What if I get it wrong? The silence stretched. The lamp flickered. Outside, the night continued its slow progression toward dawn. And then, for the fourth time, the voice came. But this time there was a difference. This time the name was repeated, spoken twice, with an intimacy and urgency that had not been there before. "Samuel! Samuel!" The repetition is significant. In Hebrew, when a name is called twice, it indicates intimacy, urgency, importance. Abraham, Abraham, Moses, Moses. Now Samuel, Samuel. This was not a casual summons. This was personal, direct, unmistakable. This time, the boy was ready. Following Eli's instructions exactly, word for word, he responded with the words that have echoed through millennia as the perfect posture of faith, the ideal response to divine initiative. "Speak, for your servant is listening." And God spoke. What happened next was not what a child would want to hear. God did not give Samuel a message of encouragement or blessing. He did not reveal some beautiful mystery or share some cosmic secret about the nature of reality or the structure of heaven. He did not offer comfort or promise Samuel a glorious future. Instead, God gave Samuel a prophecy of judgment, and the judgment was against Eli's household, against the man who had been like a father to him, against the only family he had truly known. God told Samuel that he was about to do something in Israel that would make the ears of everyone who heard it tingle. That phrase, ears tingling, suggests something shocking, something that would reverberate through the nation like a physical sensation. This was not going to be a quiet judgment, a private correction. This was going to be public, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. He was going to carry out against Eli everything he had spoken concerning his family, from beginning to end. There had been warnings before. A prophet had come to Eli years earlier with a similar message, speaking of judgment to come, of the priesthood being taken from his lineage, of his sons dying on the same day. That prophecy had been spoken and then seemingly forgotten, filed away as one of those uncomfortable truths that people acknowledge but never really expect to see fulfilled. But God was saying now that the time of fulfillment had come. The warnings were over. The judgment was at hand. The reason was clear and devastating. Eli knew about the sins of his sons. He knew they were blaspheming God, treating the sacred as profane, exploiting women, stealing from the altar, corrupting worship itself. He had heard the reports. He had seen the evidence. He had confronted them, yes, but his rebukes were empty, carrying no weight, leading to no consequences. He had failed to restrain them, failed to use his authority to stop them, failed to choose God's honour over his son's comfort, and that failure, that complicity through inaction, meant that the guilt of Eli's house would never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Think about what that means. In a religious system built entirely around sacrifice and atonement, where every sin could theoretically be covered by the blood of animals and the proper rituals, God was declaring that some corruption runs too deep for ritual to reach. Some betrayals are so fundamental that the system itself cannot address them. Eli's family would carry their guilt to the grave and beyond, marked forever by their choice to prioritize family loyalty over divine justice. Imagine being Samuel in that moment. You are a child, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, lying in the darkness of a sanctuary, having just heard the voice of God for the first time in your life. And the message you have been given is not one of blessing or calling or future glory. It is a message of doom for the man who has raised you, who has taught you everything you know about worship and service, who has been your only father figure in a life marked by abandonment and loneliness. The weight of it must have been crushing. How do you speak words of judgment to someone you love? How do you become the bearer of bad news that will break someone's heart? How do you look into the eyes of a man who has shown you kindness and tell him that his family line is cursed, that his sons will die, that everything he has built will crumble? This was the cost of prophecy that no one talks about. This was the burden of truth that cannot be softened or avoided or delayed. Samuel had been given a message, and whether he wanted to deliver it or not was irrelevant. The truth had been spoken to him, and now he was responsible for speaking it to others. This is what it means to be a prophet. Not visions and mystical experiences and spiritual heights, but the grinding, awful responsibility of speaking truths that wound you as deeply as they wound those who hear them. The rest of the night must have been agony for Samuel. The text tells us he lay there until dawn, too afraid to tell Eli what he'd heard. He did not sleep. How could he? His mind must have raced through possibilities. Maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe there was a way to soften the message to make it less harsh. Maybe if he just kept quiet, the whole thing would fade like a dream, and he could go back to his simple life of tending lamps and sweeping floors. But deep down, he knew. The voice had been too clear. The message had been too specific. And God had not asked his opinion about whether this was a good idea or whether Samuel felt ready for such responsibility. The divine does not consult us about our readiness. It simply calls, and we must answer. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Message. As morning light began to filter into the sanctuary, pale and hesitant through the high windows, Samuel rose and went about his duties as usual. Muscle memory guided him through the familiar routines. He opened the doors of the house of the Lord, pushing aside the heavy wooden barriers that sealed the sacred from the profane, letting in the day, with all its ordinary demands. But everything felt different now. The air was heavier, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. The silence was louder, filled with the words he carried but could not speak. He carried within him words that would change everything, and he was terrified to voice them. His hands shook as he performed his tasks. He fumbled with the lamp wicks, nearly spilling oil on the floor. He could not meet anyone's eyes. Every sound made him jump, expecting Eli to call for him, to demand the message, to force him to speak the unspeakable. Eli, however, knew something had happened. Years of serving in the sanctuary had given him an intuition about spiritual matters that his failing eyesight could not diminish. He could sense the change in Samuel, could feel the weight the boy was carrying. He called Samuel to him, his voice gentle but insistent, and when the boy came, reluctant and pale, the old priest asked him directly, "Samuel, my son, what was it he said to you? Please do not hide it from me." Then he added words that carried the weight of both authority and desperation. "May God deal with you, be it ever so severely if you hide from me anything he told you." It was an oath, a binding formula that made concealment impossible. Eli was not giving Samuel an easy out. He was demanding truth, however painful, however devastating. And in doing so, he was teaching Samuel one of the most important lessons of prophetic ministry: that truth matters more than comfort, that integrity requires speaking even when silence would be kinder. There is something deeply moving about this moment. Eli was giving Samuel permission to speak truth, even painful truth. He was not demanding a comfortable answer. He was not pressuring the boy to lie or soften the message. He was not using his position as high priest to intimidate or manipulate. He was simply asking for honesty, for the faithful delivery of whatever word had been given, regardless of personal cost. Samuel, to his credit, did not hold back. He told Eli everything, every word of the judgment, every detail of the coming consequences, every aspect of the doom pronounced against his house. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not try to make it easier to hear. He did not add comforting caveats or suggest ways the judgment might be avoided. He simply delivered the message as it had been given to him, faithful to both God and to Eli in his refusal to distort the truth. The words must have felt like stones in his mouth, each one heavy and sharp. He would have watched Eli's face as he spoke, looking for signs of anger or rejection or denial. But what he saw instead was something he had not expected. Eli's response is remarkable in its humility and resignation. He did not rage against the pronouncement. He did not question Samuel's experience or suggest the boy had misunderstood or imagined things. He did not blame Samuel for being the messenger or accuse him of disloyalty or ingratitude. He simply said, with a weariness that spoke of years of knowing this moment would come, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." There is defeat in those words, yes, but there is also acceptance, a kind of peace that comes from finally having the truth spoken aloud, from no longer living in the shadow of unacknowledged reality. Eli had known for years that his sons were corrupt. He had known that his failure to stop them was a kind of complicity, a betrayal of his calling and his God. The judgment was not a surprise. It was an inevitability finally spoken aloud, a truth that had been hovering unspoken in the air for years, finally given voice and substance. And perhaps in some way, Eli was relieved that the silence had been broken, even if the words spoken were words of judgment. Perhaps there is a relief that comes from knowing, from having certainty, even when that certainty is terrible. Perhaps after years of wondering when the hammer would fall, there was a strange comfort in finally hearing it fall, in knowing the shape of the future even when that future was dark. What Samuel learned that night and that morning was something most of us spend a lifetime avoiding. That truth is not always comfortable, that faithfulness sometimes means delivering hard words, and that love does not require us to hide reality from those we care about. Samuel could have lied to Eli. He could have softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details, or suggested that perhaps he had misunderstood what God was saying, but he chose honesty, and in doing so he established the pattern that would define his entire ministry. He would be a prophet who spoke the word of the Lord without compromise, without concern for how it would be received, without fear of the consequences. Not because he was harsh or unfeeling, but because he understood that truth, however painful, is ultimately an act of respect. To lie to someone even to spare their feelings is to treat them as less than fully human, as incapable of bearing reality. Samuel gave Eli the dignity of truth, and Eli received it with the dignity of acceptance. Chapter 5. Samuel becomes a prophet. After that night, everything changed for Samuel. The text tells us that he grew, and the Lord was with him, letting none of his words fall to the ground. That phrase, letting none of his words fall to the ground, is the ancient way of saying that everything Samuel prophesied came true. He was not speaking his own opinions or making educated guesses or offering the kind of vague predictions that could be interpreted multiple ways, depending on how events unfolded. He was speaking with divine authority, and reality itself confirmed his words with uncomfortable precision. The prophecy about Eli's house came true exactly as Samuel had spoken it. The details are grim and worth recounting because they establish Samuel's credibility as a true prophet in a time when false prophets were common and people had grown cynical about divine communication. Israel went to war against the Philistines, their perennial enemy. In the first battle, the Israelites were defeated and thousands of soldiers died. In desperation, the elders decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to the battlefield, believing that God's physical presence would guarantee victory. Hophni and Phinehas accompanied the Ark, treating it like a magical talisman rather than the throne of the living God. The Israelites shouted when the Ark arrived, a roar so loud that the ground shook. The Philistines were terrified at first, knowing the stories of what the God of Israel had done to Egypt. But they fought anyway, and in the battle that followed, Israel was utterly defeated. 30,000 soldiers died, and on that same day, exactly as prophesied, both Hophni and Phinehas were killed. The Ark of God was captured by the Philistines, carried off as a trophy of war. When a messenger brought the news to Shiloh, Eli was sitting by the road, his heart trembling for the Ark of God. When he heard that the Ark had been captured and his sons were dead, the 98-year-old priest fell backward off his chair, broke his neck, and died. The priesthood of his line ended in that moment, cut off exactly as God had declared. It was a devastating fulfillment, but it established beyond doubt that Samuel spoke with divine authority. He had predicted these events when he was just a child, and they had come to pass exactly as he said. The word of the Lord through Samuel was reliable, trustworthy, deserving of attention. As Samuel matured from boy to young man, his reputation spread throughout Israel like wildfire. From Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the deep south, spanning the entire geographical extent of Israel's territory, everyone knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord. The word that had been rare, the visions that had been scarce, now flowed through this young man who had learned to listen in the darkness. But Samuel was more than just a prophet delivering occasional messages. God continued to appear at Shiloh, revealing himself to Samuel through his word on a regular basis. Samuel became the primary channel of divine communication for the entire nation. The silence had been broken. The channel between heaven and earth, clogged by corruption and complacency for generations, had been cleared. And the instrument God chose was not a powerful warrior or a cunning politician or even an experienced priest with decades of religious training. It was a boy who had learned to say 5 simple words: "Speak, for your servant is listening." Samuel's influence on Israel cannot be overstated. He became the bridge between the chaotic era of the judges and the establishment of the monarchy, standing at one of the most critical transitions in the nation's history. He was the last judge, travelling on a circuit through Bethel, Gilgal and Mizpah, settling disputes and administering justice with a wisdom that people recognized as coming from God. He was also the first of the great prophets, the founder of a prophetic tradition that would produce Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all the voices that would call Israel back to God throughout its history. When the people demanded a king like the surrounding nations, it was Samuel who anointed Saul, a tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin, as Israel's first king. And when Saul proved disobedient and unfaithful to God, it was Samuel who had to deliver yet another hard message of judgment, who had to watch another man he had elevated fall under divine displeasure. Later, it was Samuel who anointed David, the youngest son of Jesse, a shepherd boy with no apparent qualifications except that God had chosen him. That shepherd boy would become Israel's greatest king, the man whose lineage would eventually produce the Messiah. But beyond the political role, beyond the anointing of kings and the settling of disputes, Samuel represented something Israel desperately needed: spiritual integrity in a world corroded by compromise. In a time when the priesthood had become corrupt, when worship had become hollow, when the word of the Lord was rare, Samuel embodied what it meant to hear from God and speak his truth faithfully regardless of personal cost. He reformed religious life throughout Israel, establishing schools of prophets where young men could learn to listen for God's voice and speak his word. He called the people back to authentic worship, challenging them to put away their foreign gods and serve the Lord only. He led the nation in repentance at Mizpah, where they fasted and confessed their sins, acknowledging that they had abandoned God. And when the Philistines attacked during that gathering, Samuel interceded for the people, and God threw the enemy into confusion with thunder and lightning, giving Israel a decisive victory. Samuel demonstrated that God had not abandoned his people, that the silence had been circumstantial rather than permanent, that divine presence and power were still available to those who would seek them with integrity. The boy who once cleaned floors and trimmed lamp wicks became the conscience of a nation. The child who slept near the ark became the voice through which God spoke to kings and commoners alike. His authority came not from position, or political power, or military might, but from the simple fact that he had learned to listen and had the courage to speak what he heard, even when speaking cost him dearly. Chapter 6. The Legacy of the Story. So what do we take from this ancient narrative? What does it mean for us, centuries removed from oil lamps and tabernacles and sleeping near the Ark of the Covenant? And perhaps more intriguingly, what questions does this story raise that it never fully answers? First, there is the theme of listening. God can speak in quiet places, in ordinary moments, when we least expect it. Samuel was not performing some elaborate spiritual ritual when God called his name. He was not fasting on a mountain. He was not in a trance or a vision quest. He was sleeping, exhausted from a day of mundane labour. He was simply present in a sacred space, available to be awakened. How often do we miss the voice of the divine because we are too busy, too distracted, too convinced that revelation only comes in spectacular packages? We wait for burning bushes and angelic visitations, for dramatic signs and unmistakable interventions, while the still small voice speaks in the darkness and we mistake it for our imagination, or for human conversation, or for nothing at all. Samuel teaches us that sometimes the most profound moments arrive softly, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the darkness when our defences are down and our minds are quiet enough to hear what has always been speaking. But this raises uncomfortable questions. How many times has that voice spoken and we have ignored it? How many times have we attributed divine communication to coincidence or psychology or wish fulfillment because we have lost the ability to recognize it for what it is? Second, there is the theme of obedience. Samuel's first response when he heard his name was immediate and complete. Here I am. No hesitation, no calculation, no weighing of options or considering whether this was a good time, just presence and availability. Not, what do you want, but here I am. Not, let me think about it, but immediate response. Later, when Eli gave him the words to use, Samuel followed the instruction exactly. He did not improvise or try to improve on the formula or insert his own personality into the exchange. He simply said what he had been taught to say: "Speak, for your servant is listening." Obedience in this story is not about blind submission to authority. It is about being teachable, about recognizing when someone knows more than you do. about trusting guidance even when you do not fully understand where it is leading. But there is something deeper here, something that troubles the waters of easy interpretation. Samuel was obedient to a voice he had never heard before, to a presence he could not see, based entirely on the instruction of a priest whose own family was corrupt, and whose judgment had been compromised by his failure to discipline his sons. What made Samuel so certain that this was God speaking and not some other voice? What internal compass guided him toward trust when skepticism would have been equally reasonable? Third, there is the theme of humility. Samuel's greatness began in small acts of service. He was faithful in opening doors, in cleaning, in tending lamps, in all the unglamorous work that keeps a sacred space functioning. He did not despise the small things, or consider himself above menial tasks. He swept floors with the same attention he later brought to anointing kings. He trimmed lamp wicks with the same care he would later exercise in delivering prophetic words, and it was in that posture of humble service, in the daily repetition of small faithful acts, that God found him. How different this is from our modern obsession with platform and visibility, with making a name for ourselves and ensuring everyone knows our accomplishments, with treating service as a stepping stone to something better rather than as its own reward. Samuel reminds us that true influence is built in obscurity, that character is formed in the small decisions no one sees, that greatness is the fruit of faithfulness in little things rather than the result of ambitious self-promotion. But again, there is a mystery here. Why Samuel? What was it about this particular boy that made him suitable for this calling? The text gives no indication that he was exceptional in any way. He was simply there, simply faithful, simply available. Which raises the question, are there others who are equally faithful, equally available, who never heard their name called? Is divine calling arbitrary, or is there some hidden criteria that determines who hears the voice and who does not? Fourth, there is the theme of responsibility. Sometimes truth is hard but necessary. Samuel's first message from God was a message of judgment, and he had to deliver it to someone he loved. This is the cost of being a conduit for truth. You do not get to choose which messages are convenient and which are difficult. You do not get to edit reality to make it more palatable. You do not get to withhold hard truths, because speaking them might damage relationships or cost you social capital. If you are going to be a voice for something beyond yourself, whether you call that voice God or conscience or truth, or simply what is, you have to be willing to speak even when the words cut you as deeply as they cut those who hear them. Samuel could have spared Eli. He could have lied or softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details. But he chose the harder path of honesty, and in doing so he honoured both Eli and himself. Yet this raises ethical questions that the narrative does not resolve. What is the balance between truth and compassion? When does speaking hard truths become cruelty disguised as honesty? Samuel was a child delivering a message he did not create and could not change. But what about us? When the truths we must speak are filtered through our own perceptions and biases and limited understanding, how do we know when to speak and when to remain silent? Fifth, there is the theme of hope. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Even in the darkest period of Israel's spiritual life, when the priesthood was corrupt and the word of the Lord was rare and the nation was spiritually adrift, there was still a light burning somewhere in the darkness. God had not abandoned his people. He was simply waiting for someone who would listen, someone who would respond, someone who would be faithful with what was given to them. Samuel represents the truth that it is never too late for renewal, that no matter how far things have fallen, no matter how corrupt the systems or how cynical the people, there is always the possibility of a voice in the darkness calling us back to what matters. The light may be flickering, the wick may be nearly consumed, the oil may be running low, but as long as there is any light at all, there is hope for rekindling, for replenishment, for the dawn that follows even the longest night. But this optimistic reading sits uncomfortably with the historical reality. The lamp did eventually go out. The sanctuary at Shiloh was destroyed. The ark was captured and never returned to that place. The line of Eli ended in blood and disgrace. Samuel's calling did not prevent disaster, it only narrated it before it happened. So what kind of a hope is this? Is it simply the hope that truth will be spoken, even if it changes nothing? Is it the hope that someone will bear witness, even in the midst of collapse? Finally, there is something unspoken in this narrative that deserves attention. God bypassed the entire religious hierarchy to speak to a child. He did not go through official channels. He did not honour the established order. He did not consult with the high priest or seek permission from religious authorities. He simply called out in the darkness to a boy who had no status, no authority, no credentials beyond faithfulness in small things. This is either deeply encouraging or deeply unsettling, depending on your perspective. It suggests that divine communication is not controlled by institutions, that truth can emerge from the margins, that the voice of God might speak to those we least expect, rather than to those we've designated as official intermediaries. But it also raises anarchistic questions about authority and order, about how we distinguish genuine divine calling from delusion or manipulation, about what happens when everyone claims to hear the voice of God speaking contradictory messages. Samuel's story is ultimately about availability. He was not the most powerful person in Israel. He was not the most educated or the most connected. He was simply present, attentive, and willing to respond when he heard his name called. And that was enough. That has always been enough. But it invites us to ask, what are we available for? What sacred spaces do we inhabit, whether physical or spiritual or psychological, where we might be found by whatever calls to us in the darkness? And when that call comes, will we recognize it, or will we mistake it for something ordinary, something explainable, something that requires no response? Epilogue: The Voice in the Night. Close your eyes and imagine that sanctuary again. The vast stone building in Shiloh, the oil lamps casting their gentle light, the shadows dancing on walls that have witnessed generations of worship and neglect. Imagine the boy lying near the ark, exhausted from a day of simple service, drifting into sleep with no expectation that this night will be different from any other. And then the voice, clear, personal, undeniable, a voice that breaks through the silence of heaven and calls a child by name. Samuel's story is a reminder that the divine does not always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes as a whisper in the darkness. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a question repeated until we finally understand that we are being addressed. Sometimes the most significant moments of our lives happen when we are alone, unguarded, simply present in a space where we have made ourselves available to something greater than ourselves. The lamp of God is still burning. That is the promise embedded in this ancient narrative. No matter how dark the times, no matter how corrupt the systems, no matter how silent heaven seems, there is always a light somewhere refusing to go out, and there is always the possibility that in the quiet, in the stillness, in the spaces between our busy thoughts and desperate prayers, we might hear our name spoken by a voice we do not yet recognize. The question is not whether the voice is calling. The question is whether we are listening. Samuel lay in that sanctuary as a boy and became a prophet because he learned to say 5 words that changed everything. Speak, for your servant is listening. He did not demand proof. He did not negotiate terms. He did not insist on understanding everything before committing to anything. He simply made himself available, and availability was enough. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Samuel's calling. Not that he became powerful or influential or historically significant, though he became all those things. The real legacy is that he teaches us what it looks like to be genuinely open to transformation, to be willing to hear hard truths, to be faithful in small things while waiting for larger purposes to reveal themselves. In our age of constant noise and perpetual distraction, where silence is something to be feared rather than cherished, Samuel's story feels almost subversive. It suggests that the most important communications might not come through our devices or our carefully curated information streams. They might come in the quiet, in the dark, in the moments when we stop performing and simply exist in the presence of something that knows our name. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, Consider the possibility that you, too, might be lying in a sacred space, even if you do not recognize it as such. Consider the possibility that there might be a voice, gentle and persistent, calling your name in the darkness. Consider the possibility that the most profound transformation of your life might not begin with a grand revelation or a spectacular sign, but with the simple decision to respond to that voice with 5 words. Speak, for your servant is listening. The lamp is still burning. The voice is still calling. The only question is whether we have ears to hear.